now let's get back into control. There's the whole idea of governor general that comes in, and so things like that.
Yeah.
To talk to us about like how that evolves at that time, and what lessons, if any, that might have for today as nation states start to figure out, okay, how do we really think about even regulating these big tech firms that are often now bigger, more powerful than even nation states of most countries in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially as you get into the 19th century, you see but you saw it earlier as well, a great deal of discomfort with the uncontrollability of all of these different colonial enterprises outside the world. So the state, and so the state, and again, I'll say this because the purposes of, eventually one has to sort of simplify or boil things down. But I want to say, when I talk about the state, you also are talking about, I said this before, not a single body acting in concert all the time, but a lot of competing. I mean, you think about it. All states have political differences. All states have technical debates. In 19th century Britain, one of the functional sort of dynamics or debates in the inside of the state would have been like, say, the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office, or people inside the Colonial Office having different ideas about how things should get done. Right. So that's important to realize. And some of them like the company model. Some of them just really dislike the company model. But if we want to think about it on that big level, the states, the British state, for example, brings to bear ideas about, say, legal regulation, questions of how it might use charters and incorporation, articles of incorporation, and various legal mechanisms to hold the people who are running these companies accountable for their actions based upon British law. At the same time, those people argued back, who are these people running the state? Do they know how colonialism works? This is a parliamentarian representing some little constituency in North England. What does he know about this? And so the debate argument goes back and forth.
It's a tech firm today. Sorry to interrupt. It's a tech firm saying today, you don't understand what artificial intelligence is. You don't understand, 20 years ago, you don't understand what the internet is. And so how are you better placed to regulate what we should be doing, right? So,
so
parallels of
the debate, those debates, and I say, you mentioned before that I like to talk about genealogy, that is to say, how things evolve over time to become what they're then, rather than analogies. But the one exception to that rule, or what I say in the book, is that I said this before, what I really think the history lets you do is it lets you look at the questions, right, and see how they played out. And I couldn't agree with you more. You see very similar things going on today with companies, say some new regulatory model, say there's an investigation, right? The companies are confronted, and the companies are saying, well, we know our business and you don't, to the state. This is exactly what the East India Company, for example, or a number of these companies would say to the British state. The other thing they would do, and this is also, I think, a parallel with today, and one of the reasons I wrote this book as a historian, is underneath the arguments or the stories I tell in this book are one recurring theme from the 16th to 20th centuries, which is when these companies were asked to justify themselves against those who would say either regulation, we can be regulated, or even more extremely, that colonization is the business of the state, which a lot of people came to argue at every point in this, including from Charles I taking away the Virginia Company's charter in 1625, right?
Yeah.
Is their argument was historical. They would say, but this is how we've always done it. This is how British colonialism, and the South Australia Company in the 19th century, its petition for a charter cites Humphrey Gilbert from the 16th century, and the Virginia Company of the 17th century, saying this is the British model of how this is done, right? So history becomes an argument, and you see this. I think you see this in contemporary models as well, saying this, the government has not been involved in this. Don't get involved now. And so if you want to think about what states might take from the argument, it's not the only lesson you might take from this history, is to sort of understand how that the sleights of hand sometimes that are in those historical arguments, if that makes sense.
And of course, the other piece that we talk about as the defense that these colonial corporations use when they're now under threat of regulation and pullback is this idea of private property, right? So they pick on that legal point that is dear to many in the members of parliament that are looking to regulate, right? And they know that the members of parliament or these landed elites the last thing they want is for the concept of private property to suddenly come under question. So I thought that was also a very smart sleight of hand, you can call it, or a smart argument to begin with, that whatever private property we have now gained in lands in foreign territories is ours. It cannot be the
Well,
state's.
I think you're totally right about that, and thanks for bringing it up, because I would say, if I were to pick two prevailing arguments in addition to the historical one, that you can see also mobilized today with, say, multinational corporations in relation to not just any state, but international law, for example. There are two arguments that are made by companies throughout this book that are worth paying attention to. One is the private property question, the question that not only do these companies claim private property in the territories and other resources they have outside of Britain, but they claim private property in the rights they have in the first place, charters, for example, or grants, right? But the other thing that's really critical, and again, one of these other things that I knew going into the book but didn't really understand until I really spent years grappling with it, is how many times these companies make arguments against regulation based on the fact that they're not only British companies, but say the holder of a Mughal Divani, right? To say that these rights are vested in sometimes treaties, sometimes grants and concessions, oftentimes completely fabricated rights. This happens most notoriously in the late 19th century Africa, for example, that the idea that these companies' sovereignty and their rights are vested in some kind of set of agreements, sometimes conquest comes through different ways in different places, vested in indigenous forms of sovereignty that the British Crown has no authority over and therefore can't get rid of. Quick example, the British North Borneo Company, which becomes a model for a lot of these African colonial ventures in the late 19th century, and is actually, in a weird way, an offshoot by accident of the East India Company, not accident, but it's not an East India Company project, but is related to long sort of history that wouldn't have happened in some ways without the East India Company's expansion in the region. The British, when the British North Borneo Company is requesting a charter from the British Crown, there are officials in the British government who argue we should give it to them because actually they're going to do it anyway, because they claim their sovereignty by the rights that they've sort of acquired in Borneo, and a charter is actually our only way of having any authority or say over what they do. So something that was an enabling process early on becomes a limiting process later, if that makes sense. And so that's part of the story. So I think those two things, and you see this constantly. This is the one that I was really taken with. I probably don't talk about it in the book as much as I could, but thankfully people like you give me opportunities to muse about it a little bit more, which is think about the parallels with corporations that redomicile themselves or that diffuse their assets and their governance in ways so that they can say, well, I'm not an American company or I'm not a British, right. And that, oh, you can't eliminate this company. And the East India Company made this argument up until, and through its removal from government in 1857, 1858. And, well, you can't get rid of us. We have all of this. That would be to break all of these agreements we have in India and around Asia. It weaves, these corporations weave their way into the fabric of governance around the world, and very difficult to untangle. So one of the things in this book I kind of try to make the point is that we have this idea that the states authorize these companies and they can easily get rid of them. But part of the story of this book is just how difficult it is for other forms of government. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we've spoken about the concept of venture colonialism. We've talked about the tug of war between the state and the private corporations. We've drawn some parallels with the big tech firms of today.